Module 5, Process Addictions, Part 1. Welcome to Module 5, Process Addictions. Process or behavioral addictions are a controversial topic in the mental health field. Professionals have long debated whether specific behaviors can be diagnosed as an addiction or if they better meet the criteria of an impulse control disorder or an obsessive-compulsive disorder. In Module 5, you will learn about the research supporting the designation of behaviors as an addiction, the commonalities between chemical and process addictions, the diagnostic issues, and the different types of process addictions. In Part 1 of this week's lecture, we will talk about the great debate between whether or not a process or behavior can be considered an addiction, the case for behaviors being an addiction, and the difference between compulsivity and impulsivity and how these terms relate to process addictions. Before we move into the lecture information, I'd like you to think about the following questions. What critiques have you read of diagnosing or labeling a behavior as an addiction? And what evidence exists for the diagnosis of a process or a behavior as an addiction? Some researchers and clinicians in the addictions field believe that the term addiction should only be applied to circumstances that involve chemical substances. Others in the field stress the need to understand addiction in a broader context. Those who view addiction in a broader context consider using the same criteria for chemical addiction diagnosis to process or behavioral addictions. Those who argue against process or behavioral addictions being considered an addiction often state that these behaviors are better understood as being either an obsessive-compulsive disorder or an impulse control disorder. We will discuss why process or behavioral addictions best fit in the category of addictive disorders later in this lecture. First, let's talk about the case for process addictions. Individuals engage in compulsive behaviors for the same reasons that they engage in compulsive substance use. The hallmarks or symptoms of chemical addiction are observed in process addictions. Hopefully we all are familiar with the terms compulsion, tolerance, withdrawal, abuse, denial, and relapse. Again, those are those hallmarks that we would see with chemical addictions, and we also observe those when an individual is suffering from a process addiction. Process addictions can also be triggered by the same factors, so we'll see commonalities with genetic, environmental, and the repetition of behaviors with process addictions, just as we already know we do with chemical addictions. Process addictions alter the brain chemistry in the same way as addictive substances do, those chemical addictions. And then the final point here is that the overriding illness is the addiction, which involves lack of control over the behavior. So if we remember watching Dr. McCauley's videos, that should be something that we're all familiar with now, that term. The overriding illness is the addiction, which involves lack of control over the behavior. Continuing on with the support for process or behavioral addictions, we also know that there's been a good deal of research today conducted that shows both genetic and environmental factors play a role in the development of a process or behavioral addiction. For example, with genetic factors, we know that there are some twin studies that show compulsive gambling has between a 50 to 60% susceptibility rate due to genetic factors. Obesity and compulsive eating has been shown to have a high genetic component. And over 90 genes have been identified as having a susceptibility to addictions, chemical or behavioral. Further, researchers think that people with certain genes, such as the DRD2A1 allele gene, might have less dopamine receptors than is normally seen. Therefore, they seek out situations that release excess dopamine, which we see in both chemical and process addictions. And then the environmental factors access to situations that encourage addictive behaviors. We would see a history of abuse and also a history of mood disorders. We'll now move into talking about compulsivity versus impulsivity. To start today's lecture, we discussed how many researchers and clinicians argue against behaviors as an addictive disorder because they are better understood as an impulse control disorder or an obsessive compulsive disorder. We will now move into discussing compulsivity and impulsivity in more broad terms, and you will learn how both compulsivity and impulsivity relate to addictive disorders. However, these terms do not perfectly explain addiction in a way that makes an impulse control disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder the best diagnostic category for process addictions. Today's lecture, we're hoping to point out that behaviors or processes that individuals engage in do best fit under the diagnosis of an addictive disorder. So we know that process addictions are repetitive behaviors. When I talk about diagnosing, I hope that you all are familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, abbreviated as the DSM, which has been composed by the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA. This text helps aid clinicians and physicians in diagnosing clients with mental health issues such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other addictive disorders. When we talk about things like impulsivity, we could look at impulse control disorders such as skin picking, which is the repetitive, harmful impulse to pick skin, picking at scabs, picking at hair. We could also look at eating disorders, which have their own category in the DSM, or gambling disorder, which fits in under addictive disorders in the new DSM-5. Some other impulse control disorders that we may know would be, for example, kleptomania, or the impulse to steal, and impulse control disorders are characterized by an individual's inability to resist the urge to do something harmful to themselves or others, harm being the key here in that diagnosis. Eating disorders and gambling and other process addictions share some of these same signs of impulsivity. Same with compulsivity. Impulsivity and compulsivity are natural behaviors controlled by the brain mechanisms that are essential for survival. Compulsiveness is related to increased frontal lobe activity, and impulsivity is related to decreased frontal lobe activity. I'm going to say this again because this is a point that you all should remember for your exam and quizzes in this course. This is an important point. So compulsiveness is related to the increased frontal lobe activity, whereas impulsivity is related to decreased frontal lobe activity. Pathological impulsivity and compulsivity characterize a broad range of mental disorders. Behaviorally, they are the core most debilitating symptom in the disorders in which they occur. So let's look at a comparison of the two. I think that this is a really helpful chart in understanding the differences and similarities between impulsivity and compulsivity, and also how they end up relating to substance abuse disorders. So first we'll look at impulsivity. Impulsivity includes impulsive choice as a steeper reward discounting. The individual is going to have a delayed aversion. There is a lack of consideration when making decisions. There is a change in response criterion, and there is a timing impairment. So you can see off to the side here, we would see characteristics of symptoms such as mania, personality disorders, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, otherwise known as ADHD. Overall, an individual suffering from impulsivity's actions are poorly conceived, prematurely expressed, unduly risky, or inappropriate to the situation, and they often result in undesirable consequences. Now let's look to the right side at compulsivity. These individuals have rigid strategies or attentional sets. There are often inappropriate persistence of habits despite negative consequences. These individuals' actions persist despite the actions being inappropriate in the context of their situation. The actions have no obvious relationship to the overall goal and often result in undesirable consequences. We can think about things such as compulsive door locking, where an individual has to unlock and lock the door 8 times. Again, this would be an inappropriate persistence of a habit despite maybe a negative consequence, such as it takes needless time away, but it's just not needed to accomplish the task at hand. Examples of compulsive disorders can include schizophrenia, autism, and obsessive compulsive disorder. This diagram also highlights the overlap between the two terms in that there is often motor disinhibition and an impaired ability to stop a response or sequence. Combined, impulsivity and compulsivity can both be seen in substance abuse and eating disorders. So both impulsive tendencies and compulsive tendencies are true to the symptoms that we see in individuals that suffer from addictive disorders. Let's move into focusing on impulsive behaviors. Many different definitions exist, but in general, impulsive behaviors are actions that are poorly conceived, they are prematurely expressed, they can be unduly risky or inappropriate to the situation, and this goes back to that key piece that I mentioned earlier, that impulsive behaviors, we have this issue with harm to either self or others, so that key piece there, that factor of harm existing. And often these result in undesirable outcomes. One definition of impulsive behaviors is a predisposition toward rapid, unplanned reactions to internal or external stimuli without regard to the negative consequences of these reactions to the impulsive individual or to others. Impulsivity is not always unplanned, so it's important here to remember that being impulsive doesn't mean that people don't already think through or plan out their actions. And a really good example of this would be the pathological gambler who has planned in advance to pursue their impulsive behavior. Impulsive behaviors can be conceptualized as the core symptoms of a broad range of psychiatric disorders that are often comorbid with one another, such as the cluster B personality disorders, impulse control disorders, and bipolar disorder. So compulsivity refers to repetitive behaviors that are performed according to certain rules or in a stereotypical fashion. Compulsivity is a tendency to repeat the same, often purposeless acts, which are sometimes associated with undesirable consequences. We could see this as being the repetitive need to wash one's hands. And while that might sound like something that might not have that bad of an undesirable consequence, individuals that do this can engage in that behavior so frequently that they actually blister and peel away their skin and have issues with their hands bleeding, and really bad damage to the skin of the hands. Impulsivity and compulsivity may be viewed as diametrically opposed or alternatively as similar in that each implies a dysfunction of impulse control. Each involves alterations within a wide range of neural processes, including, for example, attention, perception, and coordination of a motor or cognitive response. The takeaway point with impulsive behaviors is that process addictions will have signs of impulsivity or impulsive behaviors, but what characterizes someone having an impulse control disorder is that 1, it hurts self or other, and 2, the impulsive control behavior is the main characteristic of the individual's symptoms. For process addictions, not all process addiction behaviors hurt self or other, or at least not initially. Gambling, the first few times engaged in, may not hurt self or other to any extent. Whereas, compare this to pyromania, the act of setting destructive fires, there is great potential for harm even with that first act. Again, with process addictions, the underlying main concern for this individual is the addictive nature of the behavior, not just the presence of impulsivity. The same can be said when we think about compulsive behaviors. Process addictions, such as gambling, having sex, and eating, can be compulsively engaged in, but the individual engaging in these compulsive behaviors typically feels some sense of pleasure during the acts, but usually want to resist the behaviors due to the negative outcomes that tend to follow them. So we would see the difference between compulsivity-based diagnoses and addictive disorders, and this idea that there is pleasure at some times with the addictive disorder, but with people that have a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder, they're never engaging in those acts to receive pleasure. It's usually to ward off the unpleasant compulsive thoughts. It is important to establish a diagnostic criteria and definition of process addictions that include it as being an addictive disorder, as it would create a common clinical language, a legitimization of process addiction disorders for third-party reimbursement, and a step towards standardized treatment protocol for addictive disorders. Currently, there is the potential for an individual with a behavioral addiction to be misdiagnosed with an impulse control disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, which could lead to unsuccessful treatment outcomes. There also exist high comorbidity rates between chemical and process addictions, and overlooking the process addiction or viewing it as an impulse or compulsive disorder could lead to overlooking the chemical addiction. These are all important reasons for why we need to know how process addictions and chemical addictions include traits of impulsive behaviors and compulsive behaviors, but in a diagnostic sense, they are clinically different and fall into the category of addictive disorders. And this common language of being able to end the debate of whether or not a process addiction is a compulsive disorder or an impulsive disorder would allow us to have all of these positive benefits that would positively impact treatment decisions. In part 2 of the process addiction lectures, we will go into the specific types of process addictions. Some good examples to end with today would be pathological gambling, disordered eating or food addiction, sexual or pornography addiction, internet and television addiction, gaming addiction, and shopping addiction, and we will go into more detail with each of these types of process addictions in part 2 of this week's lecture videos.